since my first public event at Brooklyn Law School as the incoming dean. And my first event, which thrilled me, was to be with Liz Schneider at a Sparrow Fellowship luncheon a year ago. So it's already a year. I'm really happy to celebrate my first anniversary on this occasion. The Sparrow Fellowship program is unique, and it is part and parcel of what we are doing. As I was talking with some of you here briefly before we began, it's a huge signature feature that sets Brooklyn Law School apart from everyone else. It's probably the longest standing, and it's certainly the most successful public policy, public interest program in the nation. And because we're the only nation that does public interest law of this kind, we can say in the galaxy. And you know how understated and soft-selling I am. We're meeting with newly admitted students, so I'm practicing with you. This program is hugely important, and I do know that when I speak to new students and students are considering here as the place where they're going to study law, that one of the things that appeals to them are public interest, pro bono, clinical offerings. And so this is a huge program, and our intention is not just to sustain it, but to enhance it. And I commend our faculty for working on creative ways to pull these things together and to strengthen what we're doing. Now, specifically, the topic of this program today is emblematic of the very best of Brooklyn Law School. I tell you that as a newcomer to this community, how proud I was during the events after Superstorm Sandy of how our community helped each other and helped others. And I think it's emblematic that we've also been an arena and a forum where people are discussing and considering how you can do better in the advent of such catastrophic events. And so, for example, Jonathan Askin, Professor Askin, helped midwife Federal Communications Commission field hearing here, was addressing the needs for redundancy and resiliency in the networks and communications, and the advancements we've made and the lack of progress we've made in some quarters since 2011, and so on. And today's program, it follows and leads in at the same time, which is going to be interesting. It's an interesting concept. You follow and lead, but it does. It follows that tradition, but it's also leading and continuing to think through a lot of these issues. There's so many people here deserve a lot of credit for helping others. David Reese's program was phenomenal and continues to be phenomenal in that field. We've got great speakers for you, and I'd just like to have Liz come on up and continue this. I've got a few forest fires to deal with, so I'm not going to be here as much as I would like. But I'm very jealous of all of you to participate. This is going to be a very worthwhile session. Thank you all very much. Liz?
Thanks, Nick. It is wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to welcome all of you to our great speakers for this panel, for the next program, and then for the final panel. As Nick said, I'm Liz Schneider, Director of the Sparrow Fellowship Program, and I am really honored to just say a few words about the program that we're going to be participating in for the next several hours. Some of you know, some of you are here as students, as fellows, some of you are here as alums, some of you are here in public policy and advocacy and activism. But the Sparrow Fellowship Program is a program here at Brooklyn Law School that was founded more than 25 years ago to honor our esteemed alum, Ed Sparrow, who was a leading activist and lawyer doing health law and poverty law, who at the end of his life was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, but worked with the National Welfare Rights Organization and many other organizations. And the program attempts to carry on his legacy by having summer fellowships for students here at Brooklyn who come for public interest, who are committed to public interest work, to do educational programs, to do fora, to do symposia, and to reach out and work with the community. We have students who work around the globe, not only in this country, but internationally, and more than 500 students have been Sparrow Fellows since I began the program in 1983. And we are especially delighted, of course, to welcome back today some of our alums. This program today, the program that we are participating in, was developed by what has been an amazing group of students to work with, the Sparrow Fellowship Leadership Group, representing folks who are Sparrow Fellows who want to take leadership in planning our work and in thinking about where to go next. And the advocacy that this program represents is really, I think, representative of the best of the kind of public interest advocacy that we try to develop here at Brooklyn Law School, both on the ground, as this first panel will be, involved in organizing and advocacy, but also then, as we will move to, thinking about the larger policy, law reform issues, and engaging in dialogue with both city representatives and other individuals. We have an incredible group of faculty here in the law school who've been involved in this work. We're going to hear from today Greg Macy, David Reese, Chris Serkin. We have an amazing group of alums, Jane Landry Reyes and Katie Brennan on this panel, who are Sparrow alums. We have an amazing group of lawyers and activists, city government, and public policy folks. And I am especially delighted that we are able to include Seth Pinsky, director of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, who will be speaking after this panel, and Terry Matthews and Howard Slatkin from New York City Department of City Planning and other city agencies. So it really, we hope it will be a very, very lively program. I want to thank all of you who have been involved in this program. And on the bottom of the program, you can see some of the folks that on the very last page of the program, you can see some of the folks that I particularly want to honor. As you can see, we've put together participant biographies in order to save time so we can really have substance as opposed to really having to do any short work about who people are. I do want to single out two people who really made a tremendous contribution to this program. Erin Ogborn, who is a Sparrow Fellow, and Lee Wellington. And Lee, I want to single out because her work here at Brooklyn Law School has been, in a sense, the best, I think, of that effort to really bring together theory and practice both on the ground. And she is, in addition to being a law school student here at Brooklyn Law School and a Sparrow Fellow, she is also getting a master's degree in Pratt's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment and worked in city government before she came here. And it was really her engagement and Erin's engagement and the engagement of some of the other Sparrow leaders who really got Greg Macy and David Reese and Chris Serkin involved in helping to plan this and who really developed this program. And how thrilling and inspiring for me and for my colleagues to work with such an incredibly committed, smart, enthusiastic, wonderful group of fellows. It's really just absolutely the best part of what I do. So thank you all. Enjoy, and please join us for a reception after the program. Thanks. I now turn it to David Reese.
I'm not sure if this is working. It's working. Very good. So I'm David Reese here at Brooklyn Law School. I'm very excited to be moderating today's panel. Our community development clinic here at Brooklyn Law School is in a very small way providing some representation for businesses impacted by Sandy, but to moderate a panel with people working so hard on helping those most affected is very exciting. As Liz said, no need to go over biographies of our speakers because they're in your program. So let me just introduce first Jane Landry Reyes, and then we'll move on down the panel. I'm going to be pretty strict on time so that there's time for questions at the end.
Hi. So I'm a senior staff attorney at South Brooklyn Legal Services in the housing unit. And as you can imagine, our office provides direct legal services in a number of areas: housing, family law, government benefits, foreclosure, SSI, just innumerable cross sections of need, that all of which came into play after Hurricane Sandy. In Brooklyn alone, I'll focus on Brooklyn. We're a citywide program. We have offices in each of the 5 boroughs. The boroughs obviously most heavily impacted by Sandy from our clients' perspective were Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. My knowledge is more particular to Brooklyn, but certainly we were doing work in all of those boroughs. In Brooklyn alone, there were approximately 93,000 households affected by Hurricane Sandy, about half of which were low-income households. In the days after the storm, we ourselves, as a program, Legal Services, had to kind of struggle with getting back up and running. Our servers were in Lower Manhattan. We had staff who had to try to get into Manhattan, pick up those servers and bring them to Brooklyn so we could start functioning. And we knew we had to hit the ground running, literally, to get out to people in need quickly and to reconnect ourselves as advocates to be able to communicate effectively and put together a plan. And I think that the sort of theme, I'm sure, that will come out here is that I don't think anyone in the city sort of expected the need for such a long-term plan. And Legal Services really was tested in both its short-term and long-term planning skills, and we really stepped up in a way that I'm incredibly proud of. But also what I'm proud of is that we are implementing a strategy for sort of long-term planning and how to be effective in emergency response. So immediately in the days after the storm, we had to kind of get together. And we also had to think about what lawyers should be doing immediately after the storm. It's not as if everybody was running to court and needed a lawyer at that moment. They needed food, they needed shelter, they needed the basic necessities of life. However, lawyers were very important in getting out to communities that we were intimately familiar with, in coordinating response of community groups, agencies, and ourselves to get people services they needed immediately and to prevent further disasters from happening. So we literally started to go out to the places where people were. We got out to disaster relief areas. We went to food distribution sites. In the immediate days and weeks after the storm, lawyers were going to the FEMA, to centers where FEMA was set up, literally where people who had been displaced and had evacuated needed assistance with making FEMA applications, with advocating. FEMA hadn't even arrived at the disaster relief center that I went to for at least 3 to 4 days after we were there. We met people who were in really urgent, need. I met a family who had been in that shelter at FDR High School. I don't know if you're familiar with this, a big high school, Franklin Delano Roosevelt High School, which served as one of the main evacuation sites. I met a family there who had been, unwittingly approved for FEMA to move into a hotel and had languished in the shelter, which was less than ideal, for 3 days, despite already having their approval. And it was just a matter of sort of talking to them and connecting them up with the right people to get them out and into the hotel where they had already gotten an approval. So it was a funny position to be in that we were calling on our skills as a lawyer without necessarily doing typically lawyerly work, right? You might say this was social work, this was, just sort of getting out there and being a voice, but that's what we do best as lawyers and we're trained in, and it was what people needed in those immediate days. At that same shelter, we met a woman who had just had a C-section before the storm. She was home with a newborn baby. She was in a closet at the FDR shelter because she was trying to get privacy to breastfeed her child. She had been there far longer than she should have been, and it was stunning to me that need hadn't been identified until we just happened upon her and, obviously put up a big, big stink until she got into a family shelter. And it was those kinds of stories that repeated themselves over and over. The story of the family who had a head of household father who spoke only Cantonese and needed to get to work, and he had made the FEMA application, and they wouldn't allow his wife. Excuse me, I got that wrong. The father spoke English, his wife spoke Cantonese, and they wouldn't allow the wife to pursue the FEMA application in his absence. He had to come back from work where he was trying to, not lose his job during the storms to pursue the FEMA application. We ended up being able to resolve that. But it's those kinds of, glitches in bureaucracy that keep people from what they need in these kinds of immediate crises. Apart from what was happening in the evacuation centers, obviously there were still lots of people who were in their homes who hadn't evacuated, and we were trying to figure out a plan to get out to them. We would have office-wide meetings to discuss what was the best way to do that. We had community partners in a lot of places where we're starting to connect, but many of our community partners had been washed out. So the people that we relied on for information on the ground in Coney Island weren't there. Their officers were gone. We started contacting managing agents, attorneys, landlords' attorneys with whom we had relationships because, of course, this is my work. I see these attorneys in housing court every day. We started trying to get information from them. How soon would the electricity be back on? How soon would there be water? We did this kind of advocacy. And we also realized that what we needed to do, in addition to this sort of very, very hands-on direct services of advocacy and getting information out to people, was we needed to use our connections and skills to advocate with city agencies and even our opposing counsel. We started pressing these agencies, the Department of Homeless Services at the shelters. We started pressing them for moving people out of those shelters more quickly. We started pressing NYCHA for a better response to getting out to the public housing projects. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the sort of Times expose on how long it took the Housing Authority to get to people in need. Again, a sort of long-term planning, a lack of long-term planning, not knowing that you would have to get, generators out and not having an updated electrical survey to know what kind of generators you'd have to get out to your public housing project. We advocated to extend filing deadlines. There are tenants who potentially were facing eviction in housing court where their eviction's going to be stalled. We advocated with the courts to stay evictions. We advocated with other levels of government to stay statute of limitations on filing those cases for people who couldn't get there. We also worked and advocated for the authorization of special benefits like disaster-related food stamps, which is a higher level. We also wanted to be responsive in a way that was respectful to the community, that the community, that we brought to the community what they were asking for and needed, and not what we thought the community was needing. So we were, getting to the places where we could see the community response was most effective. In Coney Island, we went to the Keyspan Park to where FEMA had set up, and that wasn't where people were that day. They were at Coney Island Gospel Assembly Church. So, we were able to get in touch with each other and send our workers the other way to where people were. Right before Thanksgiving, I think I filled out about 50 disaster. Wow, 1 minute left. How'd that happen? Okay. So I'll cut out that story. But so in addition to that, we were trying to do a kind of long-term plan. We established a emergency hotline for people to call. We've done hundreds of trainings of law students, of caseworkers, of other lawyers. We have, thank you, Brooklyn Law School worked with many, many Brooklyn Law School students to help us get out to communities to do needs assessment surveys. I hired a Brooklyn Law School graduate under the program that allows for the 6-month postgraduate stipend, from that, she was able to get a public interest job working with New York Legal Assistance Group doing Sandy relief work, because now she was an expert. And so that was wonderful. And we have long-term plans. We're working on things like group HP actions where we represent a whole building, because, believe it or not, there are still buildings that have no hot water and no elevator service and this kind of thing. But the long-term plan is really and what I am most proud of is that Legal Services put ourselves first and foremost in the public eye as an organization that responds to community need and that is listening to the community for the purpose of making sure that when funds are now distributed to start the rebuilding, that the community has a voice in that and that it is done equitably and fairly. And that is our long-term plan, and that's our goal. And for that I am proud.
Thank you. So yes, time flies when you're talking about important things. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Katie Brennan at the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn.
Hi. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you for having me here. I, like Jane, am also a housing attorney at the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn. She's with Legal Services. I'm with the Legal Aid Society that we love.
We still love each other.
We
yes.
still love each other. I've been a housing attorney at Legal Aid for a while, and once Sandy happened, I'm very proud of all of my colleagues at the Legal Aid Society and all of my colleagues in the legal services community. We all started to pitch in immediately. We didn't really know what we were going to be doing. I don't know that any of us knew the scope of what we would find, but come that first Thursday or Friday after the storm, we were out in Far Rockaway, we were out in Coney Island, before there was electricity, before there was heat. I find it a little ironic that it was way warmer in January than it was in October and November when nobody had heat or hot water. We went to Coney Island the first time, and the sand dunes were 3 avenues in. I don't know if anyone's been to Coney Island, but 3 avenues in, sand everywhere, swirling, no electricity. We were primarily doing disaster, registration for FEMA and disaster replacement for disaster for food stamps. Because one of the things you don't think about is when your electricity goes out, all the food you purchased with your food stamp benefits have been ruined. And when you are living on the edges of financial insecurity, that's a lot of money to lose. So we were helping people get replacement food stamps, and we were registering people for FEMA assistance. FEMA was there, but they had people there, but the thousands of people who needed to register, there was hours waits to use FEMA's computer, there were hours waits to use the phone. For reasons I don't fully understand, despite it being a disaster with no electricity, you can only register for FEMA via electronic means, telephone or computer. It eludes my mind why that's the only way to register for that stuff, but it is. So basically what we were really doing was trying to just use our iPads and anything else we could find to help people register for the first couple of weeks. We had just rolled out, we pressed into service before it was even commemorated, a new mobile justice van. It's a fully functioning legal services office in a Winnebago. So it's got a printer, a computer. I made so much fun of it before I used it, made endless amounts of fun of it, said I would never go set foot in it. I love it. The driver who drives us out to Coney Island and Far Rockaway is amazing. We can see clients there, so we started using that right from the get-go. We also established a hotline with attorneys and pro bono attorneys who are staffing it so that people can call in to be directed to appropriate places or simply get advice on the phone. And we kept going out, and we just kept going out. We've set up staff attorneys in each office who were going to keep rotating to go to Far Rockaway, Red Hook, and Coney Island. The need was just intense. I mean, the things you don't think about, like people are on food stamps, for example. You swipe a card, but you can't get cash out for it. But the first couple of weeks, the bodegas tried to reopen, but they didn't have electricity, so they could only sell things with cash. So they didn't want to, you could call in and get the food stamps. You could call in and get the food stamp, the bodega owner could call in and get the food stamps taken off your card and get reimbursed, but they weren't going to do that. It would take them an hour. So people were hungry and they needed food. And Coney Island in particular has a lot of seniors and a tremendous amount of public housing. I knew there was a lot of public housing in Coney Island, but it floored me to see the amount of it. And it's all right off the water. And the electricity was out in a lot of public housing projects for almost up to 3 weeks. And they didn't have heat or hot water for another 2 weeks after that. And people were trapped. Seniors and disabled people were trapped floors up. We literally, both legal services and legal aid, had attorneys walking up 23 flights of stairs, finding disabled people, and then dragging the American Red Cross to them. There's actually Doctors Without Borders was there, surprisingly. I mean, I never thought I'd see Doctors Without Borders in the United States, but they were there. So anyway. So after the first couple of weeks, when the electricity was back on and things stabilized a little bit, we started going out routinely, and we discovered a lot of FEMA appeal. You know, people were starting to get feedback from FEMA about what they needed to submit to further their application, or their application was denied. People have started getting insurance denials or awards that are insufficient. Public housing tenants who have tremendous conditions, their apartments still haven't been repaired, haven't been relocated appropriately. There were a number of ground floor apartments that were in public housing that were destroyed in Coney Island, and they were placing the tenants anywhere they could find them, not always placing them so great. We had one 80-year-old woman who they are only offering her a place in northern Manhattan. She has never lived in northern Manhattan. She's lived in Coney Island for 60 years. All she was asking is that NYCHA find her a spot in Coney Island, or at least Brighton Beach, somewhere not quite so far away. We were working with NYCHA to make sure that those tenants were appropriately replaced. We were making sure that the Housing Authority, for tenants who had tenant-based subsidies, whose apartments were destroyed, that NYCHA expedited the transfer process to get them new subsidies, new vouchers to go take their rent subsidies and move to another apartment. And that was an uphill battle, but we finally got NYCHA to agree to start processing them quickly. We were running intervention with HUD, because HUD, there are a lot of public housing projects that are not specifically NYCHA, the city public housing, but also solely federally funded public housing in Coney Island, as well in Rockaway. There's a ton of public housing in Rockaway as well. Dealing with HRA and trying to get them to replace food stamps. We filed a lawsuit regarding the federal government had given the city permission, had given an infusion of cash to disaster-related areas for additional supplemental food stamps. They could have used it in any zip code that was designated a disaster, which all of New York was, but the city specifically limited it to certain zip codes, and we sued to make sure that all zip codes would receive excess benefits. Our community development unit is starting to work with small business owners to try to help them. I actually was shocked. I don't do small business, but the amount of problems that they have is insurmountable. I mean, I don't know. I met with one woman who, she had flood insurance for her home. She lost her home and her business in Coney Island. She had flood insurance for her home, not enough, but she was working through it. Her business, however, she didn't have flood insurance. So SBA, the Small Business Administration, approved her for a loan, but they take out a mortgage then. She had to then file permits and do all the stuff before they would sign off on the mortgage, the permits for the construction, and get everything approved. If anyone knows anything about New York City building regs, nobody's able to do that by themselves, ever. I don't even think, I don't know what level of lawyering it would take to pull that off. I don't think lawyers do it. I think they designate somebody else way better than they do to figure out how to get building permits. She didn't have the money, though, to hire a contractor who could get the building permits, because they wouldn't release the money until she signed the permits, until she got the permits. So it was a whole big disaster, literally. So the Small Business Administration, our community development unit has been working with small business owners to try to help them at least understand what they have to do and try to set them up with places that they can, people that help them with it. It's a lot. I mean, it's more than I had really anticipated it would be. And there is still a tremendous, tremendous need. There are a lot of people who don't have their homes back yet. They're not repaired, or they're not accessible, and the most vulnerable, the evacuees, are now being thrown out of the hotels. Because FEMA's, as of Friday or last week, FEMA decided to end the hotel stay. So our Homeless Family Rights Unit has been making a tremendous effort to go out to every shelter every hotel they can find, and try to get people hooked up with services, try to advise them of their rights to appeal the hotel, the stopping of the hotel subsidy. It was my understanding that the city could not provide us or any advocates with a set list of where they had sent all the evacuees. Nobody knew where any of them were. Like, there was no definitive list. So legally, it's been battling with the Department of Homeless Services and the city for including for seniors who were removed from nursing homes. So nobody knew where any of their vulnerable seniors were. Nobody knew where any of the evacuees were really being placed. So we've been trying every nights, weekends, going out to try to find out where everybody is to come up with services. So that's sort of where we are. We're still out there. We're still trying to figure out. We're like Jane was saying, I think the whole legal services community wants to come up with affirmative plans for the communities we care about to make sure that there's better preparation. NYCHA's emergency response, to say the least, was inadequate. The fact that people without heat and hot water for 6 weeks, some of them 2 months in some of the buildings more, and some of them in the most developed country in the world is ridiculous. Like, anybody could have told them that the boilers needed to be moved up, that they should have had, they couldn't get the boilers in time, and they're still running on power generators. They still haven't gotten the repairs to electrical systems upgraded yet. Many of them are still running on generators, which are vulnerable, and elevators are shut off for periods of time to protect the generators. And this is months out. Some of this lays at the feet of the federal government for not funding them enough, but a lot of this is poor planning on NYCHA's part and Department of Homeless Services' part and many other places.
Thank you. Eddie, are you going to go up to the podium, or are you going to?
Unless I have to. No.
You're doing PowerPoint?
Yeah.
I'll give you the clicker.
Okay. So our last speaker for the first panel is Eddie Bautista. He's the Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Eddie.
Thank you, Lee, Brooklyn Law School, and the SPERA Fellowship Program. By the way, happy 30th anniversary for the SPERA program. I don't know if it's paper or wood. I always get the gift will be forthcoming once I get the actual right. As David mentioned, I'm with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, the citywide coalition of community-based organizations from the South Bronx, Williamsburg, Bushwick, Sunset Park, West Harlem, and Morningside Heights. We represent community-based organizations who united 22 years ago to fight the systemic causes that lead to disproportionate environmental burdens and the lack of environmental amenities in these and other similarly situated communities. Our connection to this issue predates Sandy, predates Irene, predates the 2 tornadoes, last year's earthquake, predates countless nor'easters. You have to go back, in fact, to the late 90s to give you guys some context of our connection to this issue. In the late 90s, New York City updated its coastal zone management plan, which is known as the Waterfront Revitalization Program. The coastal zone management plan is the same for waterfront cities all over. Basically, it's the legal framework within which development applications are examined for consistency. Essentially, the waterfront is broken up into 4 areas. According to the Coastal Zone Management Plan, there is the natural waterfront, the recreational waterfront, the redeveloping waterfront, which is a euphemism for the gentrifying waterfront, and the working waterfront. There was a designation tagged on in the late 90s, a subset of the working waterfront called Significant Maritime and Industrial Areas. What these SMIAs do, on its surface, it's essentially an industrial retention policy. It was intended to identify zones in the city where heavy manufacturing industrial uses would be protected. And by the way, let me preface what I'm about to say with the clarification that the Environmental Justice Alliance is not anti-industry. We see ourselves as industrial retention advocates ourselves. Because there's got to be a place in this town where working people could get jobs and not have to rely on just service jobs. So we've been longtime advocates of manufacturing uses, but we also are fierce advocates for environmental protection. We don't believe the old paradigm that industry and economic development and environmental protection are at odds. In fact, they have to coexist. So we're unrelenting in our desire for environmental justice, which means beyond just environmental equity. So when we saw this designation in the late 90s, we were ambivalent because on the one hand, again, as I said, we support industrial retention. On the other hand, there was absolutely no thought, there was no context given to that. As the city has rezoned over the last 25 years, increasingly more and more land that was formerly manufacturing has been taken off the table. The whole west side of Manhattan, the whole Hudson River Park, that used to be one big manufacturing zone, right? And what happens is as you take more manufacturing land off the table, you concentrate those uses in smaller and smaller clusters of neighborhoods. Without any thoughtful environmental controls attached to that designation, we knew what we were in store for. And again, these are the communities that host, the reluctant hosts of the city's waste management, waste transfer stations, power plants, sewage treatment plants, brownfields. You guys know the drill. So we started advocating for significant maritime industrial area reform. And of course, if you remember who was running New York City in the late 90s, the Giuliani administration, but the only thing that they were more hostile to than environmental laws were civil rights. And combining the two, we were dead in the water. So fast forward, the Bloomberg administration begins its own comprehensive waterfront planning process in 2010. And we realize now we have another shot. The Bloomberg administration has proven to be a visionary administration insofar as environmental protection, sustainability, and public health. So we figured we'd have a more receptive audience for the SMIA reforms. However, what we had in 2010 that we didn't have in the late 90s was the whole issue of climate change adaptation and that awareness. And what we discovered as we started doing research shocked us. In retrospect, it shouldn't have, but at the time it did. This is a map of the city's waterfronts, and what you see there from top to bottom, A, B, C, D, E, and F, are the city's significant maritime and industrial areas. From top to bottom, it's the South Bronx, it's Newtown Creek, which is the Brooklyn and Queens borderline. It's also one of the most recently federally designated Superfund sites, one of the most polluted waterways in the country. Brooklyn Navy Yard, Red Hook, Sunset Park, and the North Shore of Staten Island. What was stunning to us was when we layered, we did GIS mapping and we layered the SMIAs over storm surge projections that were compiled by the New York State Office of Emergency Management. We realized that every single one of these SMIAs, everyone were vulnerable. Forget Category 4, forget Category 1. They were all vulnerable to like nor'easters, right? And so all of a sudden we realized that the city had been engaging in a policy that was essentially sanctioning the clustering and concentration of the heaviest industrial and chemical uses all in a handful of neighborhoods. Of course, we'd like to think if we were designing a city from scratch, we'd be smarter than that, right? We wouldn't put all of our heaviest chemical and industrial uses smack in the path of storm surges. But that's the hand we've been dealt, and New York City is not alone in that. Every waterfront city in the United States that's had industrial uses is facing this problem. It's a global problem. The thing about waterfronts is that this notion about luxury housing on the waterfront is a relatively recent phenomenon in urban history, right? For most of urban history, the waterfronts were where you put the nastiest things. The waterfronts were where you put all the stuff that society didn't want to deal with, right? All your heavy industries, your immigrants, the stuff that society did not want to deal with ended up on the waterfront. So this is not a surprise to us, but all of a sudden we realized that our communities were faced with a clear and present danger. So from 2010 through 2013, we've been advocating for the city to take this dynamic into account, and as they update the city's waterfront revitalization program to blend in, to build in climate adaptation and resiliency strategies. And to the Bloomberg administration's credit, they've been open. They included a number of our recommendations. We don't know what the final draft, how much of it reflected our concerns, because on the day that the City Planning Commission was about to vote on the latest language was October 29th. The hearing was canceled because of Sandy. It was canceled because of rain. A lot of rain, right? So we'll have to wait a while to see what that draft is going to look like. But just to give you just one or two little examples of what this means practically. This is a zoom in of the South Bronx Significant Maritime Industrial Area. And we've got over 100 maps, so we've layered on top of these SMIAs different environmental agency permit databases to get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of these exposures. So this is a map of just one database. I believe this is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Chemical and Active Bulk Storage Database. Basically, these are facilities that are permitted and have they've been authorized to use up to 400,000 gallons of oil and heavy chemicals. So of I think it's 171 of these facilities that are permitted in New York City. 17% are located within a half mile, and the dotted line represents a half-mile buffer that we drew around the SMIAs. And we picked a half mile because that's the kind of traditional the Environmental Quality Review Act. Whenever an environmental impact statement is ordered, they generally look at about a half mile in terms of impact or study of impact. So we picked a half a mile, and we realized that 17% of all of these facilities in New York City are concentrated in the South Bronx and are vulnerable to storm surge. And just to give you an example, one of the uses that we saw that's associated with these uses are, I believe it's a metal fabricator where the use of naphthalene, which is a carcinogen, was identified. And before I wrap up, two quick things. The black square that you see, that black square is the Hunts Point Food Market. The Hunts Point Food Market handles 70% of the region's produce and food. Luckily, when Sandy hit, the high tide missed this surge in the South Bronx. South Bronx was hit. It wasn't hit anywhere near like the other neighborhoods. But had high tide coincided with that storm surge, that would have been overrun, the Hunts Point Food Market. And if you think the gas line fights were bad, I can't begin to tell you guys how serious this would have been if our food supply had been cut off for the region for I don't know how many weeks. And just to give you one last example, this is the storm surge as it hit Red Hook, one of the SMIAs. That those buildings are the buildings right across from Fairway, the Civil War era warehouses, about 98% occupied, all small manufacturers, printers and the like. If you can see, this is daylight when the storm surge hit. Those are street lights that are, so basically the storm surge was, the community and the surrounding streets was already overrun, and this was hours before the worst of it hit. And we know, because New York One and several other news channels covered these businesses as small businesses that were afraid to go into their own place of business for weeks after Sandy because the watermark hit about 6 feet inside, and they knew the chemicals that they were using. So I'll stop there, but I just want to give you guys a sense of context that the Sandy stuff and the impacts that we're talking about when it comes to issues like even industrial waterfronts haven't even begun to really been analyzed by government.
So it's great. We have time for a couple of questions. Let me start it off, and if people have questions, make yourselves known. So Eddie, just if you were king of New York for a day, could put in one policy to respond to catastrophic, water crises like this, what would that one policy be?
I would have to, if I was king and I tried to do one thing, I would hope that people would rise up and throw me. I mean, there isn't one thing. It's a staggering amount of interventions that government needs to think about. And just to give you an example, we had an assembly on January 26th where nearly 200 people from across the region came to talk about what would we want to see in a Sandy recovery agenda. And literally, 25 pages of brainstorming ensued. Ironically, there was one person out of the 200 that mentioned Seagates. Okay, so, in terms of, if there were one overarching thing, I think, we need to get serious about green infrastructure. We have to get serious about understanding that when we're talking, at least in terms of storm surges, that, man-made interventions like Seagates raise their own complications. I think that we need to understand that this is a different moment and that we have to design our cities with a level of urgency and seriousness that's evaded us so far.
Great, thank you. Gentleman on my left. I think there's a microphone coming to you.
Clark from the newly formed Canarsie Disaster Relief Committee. I don't have a question, it's more like a comment. Canarsie wasn't covered extensively in the news like most parts what you all guys mentioned. However, Canarsie was hit hard. Or damage wasn't physically so you could see, but it was internally. So no one paid attention to Canarsie. Just like what you were saying, the food stamps. 11236 was denied food stamps. Or Councilman had to sue Mayor Bloomberg to include Canarsie in it. But the news, even the foundations, when it was giving up grants, they didn't include Canarsie. This is the first time I'm hearing about your services to neighborhoods. Canarsie wasn't in there. So I'm just want to tell you that Canarsie was hit bad also, and we need services also. Thank you.
Would anyone on the panel like to comment?
I do think that there were quite a few communities that did not get much press who were very hard hit, and Legal Aid has been focusing on the communities that our client population lives in, but there are many other communities where there are people in need, such as Garrettson Beach and Canarsie. I mean, there were multiple neighborhoods. They actually have an additional problem. My understanding is that they weren't a flood zone A, which means that they weren't required to carry flood insurance as a condition of getting mortgages. So many of those homeowners who sustained damage are forced to turn to loans from the SBA rather than having flood insurance reimburse them because of the way the flood maps were drawn and the requirements for flood insurance. So there is a need, and they are free to access our hotline and call us for services as well. But there are quite a few communities that are also in need, and many of them are not getting a lot of press.
I think we have time for one more question.
Standards. Describe. Sure. My name is Dan Myers. I was taught by Ed Sparrow. That's how far back I go, or how new your program is. You talked about NYCHA and its obvious failures in terms of being prepared for what transpired. The question is legal aid, is legal services preparing any kind of policy or standard that they would seek to enforce if there is such a failure, or to negotiate some kind of resolution based upon what you think has to be the minimum standards, both structurally in terms of generation and in terms of anything else, evacuation, places to evacuate, making sure there's medical attention and other things.
Yeah, I can address that briefly. I mean, I think that legal services, as I was suggesting, as getting involved and as being invited now to the table to discuss those kinds of long-term planning, and that NYCHA seriously, didn't even meet sort of basic federal, standards for what a disaster plan should look like. And so I think there are sort of basic understandings already in place of what the bare minimum should be, and that we will have an opportunity to enhance that and make sure that that there is a long-term plan in place.
So to keep us on schedule, right? We're on schedule. No, we can have some more questions actually. To have more questions, Nicole.
Yeah, my question is, when I moved to New York City a few years ago, I was driving in the Rockaways and saw that federally subsidized affordable housing was being built by the waterfront, and I was kind of astounded because my initial reaction was, why would you put the people who are most vulnerable closest to the water and eliminate wetlands to do so? So I'm just wondering, as far as long-term advocacy of where new development happens, what your organizations are focusing on.
Well, I think the answer to why they're building it is, and this, again, back to Mr. Batista's statement, I really didn't think of this either. It's cheap. I mean, lands by there are remarkably cheap for reasons that, I grew up thinking that waterfront is expensive. It's clearly not. In terms of, long-term planning for that, part of the problem is, with long-term planning for any public housing and subsidized housing in New York City is that the federal government doesn't like giving us money for it at all, ever. And we're an extremely expensive city, an extremely tightly packed city. So we tend to house our poor people as where we can, and in not always the best circumstances. I don't know what my instinct is that it's not really feasible to relocate people to better spots. There just isn't the room. I think that overall, both Legal Aid Society and Legal Services are trying to push the Housing Authority and any of the other federally funded developments near the waterfront to make sure they have adequate protections in place for the next time. Just as a matter of practicality, they can't find affordable housing for the people who are still homeless. There are 2,000 families that are still without housing, and New York City has yet to come up. There is no available public housing. So developing and keeping the stuff that we have is probably one of the few things that one of the things they need to do in addition to finding other spaces.
Just to piggyback on that, I think, again, the ironies of discriminatory patterns just keep being revisited, right? Because my understanding of the Rockaway, specifically the NYCHA developments in Rockaway, they were built to accommodate the displaced residents of Lincoln Center, and that was public housing. Is that correct? That somebody?
I think so.
I'm pretty certain that it's that. So essentially, the people were put out on the Rockaways when mostly Latino and African American tenants that were living in the current Lincoln Center were deemed, movable, and they got moved all the way out to the Rockaways. So, these patterns of discriminating against low-income people and people of color just continue. In terms of how recommendations for rebuilding, I would tell you one thing. We did, as I mentioned, we had an assembly on January 26th where we compiled and we're about ready to release pages of recommendations, and a lot of it had to do with public housing that we have already signaled to the SIRR, to Seth Pinsky's led effort, the mayor's office, and the federal government, that we're going to be submitting our recommendations for rebuilding and recovery. There's a saying in our movement, which is, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. Right? So our job is to get to the table.
Right. So unfortunately, I can't take any more questions just to keep us on schedule. But let me introduce, well, actually, first, thank you to our panel. And let me just introduce our next speaker, who is Seth Pinsky. He's the president of the Economic Development Corporation and has been a friend to Brooklyn Law School and to the Sparrow program, having spoken at some of our events before. His impressive bio is in the packet. I just want to highlight the work that he is doing on Sandy reconstruction. He's leading the city's efforts at the instruction of Mayor Bloomberg, and I'm particularly impressed by three characteristics of his efforts. First, a commitment to comprehensive planning, which should help the city avoid throwing good money after bad as we deal with the long-term consequences of this. Second, a commitment to community input in the planning process, and I think from the panel we understand how important that is. And finally, a commitment to making hard choices that will serve the city in good stead in the long term, instead of, as we've seen in some other waterfront parts of the country, where there seems to be a commitment to just doing something that appears more like a Band-Aid approach than a long-term planning approach for where we're at. So without further ado, I turn the podium over to President Pinsky so he can give us an overview of the city's efforts. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout for this, and it's always wonderful to be back in Brooklyn at Brooklyn Law School. What I thought I would do this afternoon is talk to you a little bit about the mayor's special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency. And the genesis of this special initiative is actually the early days following Hurricane Sandy. As we were moving out of the recovery efforts and moving into the longer-term planning, the mayor realized that we were presented with an opportunity, as horrible as this event was. And the opportunity that he saw was really threefold. One is, it was an opportunity for us not just to think about the short term, but instead to think about the medium term and the long term as well. Two, the mayor realized that this was an opportunity for us not just to think about the neighborhoods that were devastated by Sandy, although we need to give a lot of thought to those neighborhoods, but it was also an opportunity for us to think citywide. And three, the mayor realized that this was an opportunity for us to think not just about Hurricane Sandy or future hurricanes, but to think about climate change more broadly. And so as a result of that, he set up our special initiative. And the special initiative has been tasked by the mayor with answering three important questions. The first question is, what happened during Sandy? And I think on an anecdotal level, all of us, having lived through it, have a pretty good sense as to what happened. But he wants us to answer that not on an anecdotal level, but instead on a deep analytical level. And not just to answer what happened, but also why it happened. The second question that the mayor has asked us to answer for him is, putting aside what happened in the past, looking towards the future, what do we think the city of New York will look like given the likely impacts of climate change? And he wants us to answer that question not just in the event of acute circumstances like hurricanes, like droughts, but also in the steady state. If sea levels have risen by X feet and there is no storm, there is no drought, what does New York look like in that event? And then the third question that the mayor has asked us to answer is, so what do we do? How do we rebuild after Sandy, and how do we prepare for a future with climate change? The initiative that was set up by the mayor today is organized, as you see on the screen, and we have a team of over 30 professionals who are working on this question literally full time. I can tell you that some people have spent the night in our offices as we've tried to get these answers together as comprehensively as possible. In addition to working with our team of professionals, we are also enlisting significant outside support. We're working with experts like McKinsey and Swiss Re, the large reinsurance company, which, because its portfolio is affected by questions of climate change, has actually been thinking about questions like this a lot over the last several years. We're working with an organization called the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. We're working with FEMA, and again, we'll talk about our work with them shortly. We're working with the federal task force that's in charge of allocating federal funding. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about them. And of course, we're working with numerous city agencies. In fact, I see Howard Slatkin here from the Department of City Planning, who has been an integral part of this effort. And of course, our efforts don't just involve talking to experts and government agencies. It also involves talking to the community. And this is a very, very important part of this undertaking. And as you can see from the screen, we've had extensive consultation with elected officials, with community-based organizations, with public workshops, as well as informal meetings with advocacy organizations, labor organizations, good government groups, and others. And our intention is to continue this outreach throughout our process. And if all goes according to plan, and because I work for the mayor, I can tell you that whether I like it or not, it will go according to plan. We will have this report done in May, and our goal is to deliver it to the mayor and have the mayor deliver it to the public at that point. So what I wanted to do now was to walk you through some of our preliminary findings and show you a little bit of how we're thinking about the answers to each of these questions. Starting with our first question, which is what happened during Sandy and why? And when you think about Hurricane Sandy, one of the most important facts to understand is that this was an incredibly idiosyncratic event. For example, if you look at the chart on the screen, what you can see is that this was an enormous storm. On the left side of the screen is Hurricane Katrina. On the right side is Hurricane Sandy, over 3 times as wide as Katrina was. In addition, Hurricane Sandy, because of atmospheric conditions, which are more complicated than is necessary to get into, took a very unusual track. Whereas normally hurricanes travel up the East Coast and head out to sea, instead this storm took a leftward hook and actually crossed onto the mainland at New Jersey. And this was only the third time since the 1850s that a storm like this has taken a track like that. And as a result of that, instead of being on the western side of the storm, we ended up on the northeastern side of the storm as it came ashore, and were subject to the very significant onshore winds that Hurricane Sandy brought with her. What happened as a result of all of this, as we all know, is that there was an enormous storm surge. And as you can see from this chart that shows the top 10 high water events at the Battery in Lower Manhattan, Sandy broke all previous records. In fact, didn't just break them, it shattered those records. The previous record had been set in 1960, and it overtopped that by some 30%. Now, among the idiosyncrasies that caused this unprecedented storm surge was the timing of the storm. And these charts may look very complicated, but I think if I take a minute to explain them to you, they'll be pretty clear. On the upper left-hand corner, what you see is the harbor in Long Island Sound just prior to the arrival of Hurricane Sandy, so the night before. And what you'll see on this chart is that colors that are closer to red are where there are deeper water, and colors that are closer to purple is where there's shallower water. And what you'll note at midnight on October 29th is that the harbor and the ocean were at low tide, and the Long Island Sound was at high tide. Fast forward 6 hours later, the opposite was true. The harbor and the ocean were at high tide, and the Long Island Sound was at low tide. Now that's very important, the fact that there are different tidal cycles in Long Island Sound versus in the harbor and in the ocean. So on the bottom, what you can see is around 6 p.m., just before the storm surge arrived, it was actually once again time for it to be high tide in the southern part of the city, low tide in the northern part. And so at 7 and 8, as the storm surge actually came into the harbor, the effects in the south were much more dramatic than the effects in the north. And in fact, you can see this on this chart, which shows the water levels at the Battery. Again, a complicated chart, but I think with a little explanation, it will be clearer. The light blue line that you see is what the normal tidal cycle would be at the Battery. The green line is the surge coming in, excluding the impact of the tide, and the red is showing you the combination of the tide and the surge. And what you can see is that when Sandy arrived, when the surge hit its peak, it literally was at the exact moment of high tide in the harbor. If that surge had come just a few hours earlier or a few hours later, it's likely that there would have been no damage at all in Lower Manhattan, and that in fact we'd be talking more about neighborhoods in the Bronx and northern Queens. Another idiosyncrasy of this storm was what happened to the winds as the surge came in. There are lines on here which you definitely won't be able to see, but you'll take my word that on the left side what you can see is as the surge started to come in at about 8 o'clock on October 29th, the winds were generally moving from the north to the south. As the surge hit its peak, the winds suddenly shifted so that they were coming largely from the southeast, heading towards the northwest. And what that did was that it drove the surge into the southern parts of the city, and it whipped up the waves as the surge came in. And so as a result of this, the impacts of the storm were very particular to different parts of the city. So in the harbor, what we saw was a significant amount of inundation, but without that wave action. Whereas in the southern parts of the city, like in Staten Island, southern Brooklyn, and the Rockaways and Broad Channel, we saw not just the surge, but we also saw that wave action. And the dots that you see on the screen are buildings that were red tagged or yellow tagged by the Department of Buildings, and you can see clearly much more damage in the areas that were exposed to that open ocean wave action. Now, there were also, of course, impacts here in Brooklyn, and I thought that it might be interesting for you to see a little bit about exactly what those impacts were in this borough. One area that was impacted was the Brooklyn waterfront, and what you see here is a map of the Brooklyn waterfront showing the inundation from Sunset Park up through Newtown Creek. And what you can see from this is that there was a significant amount of inland inundation because of the area's water bodies. To understand why the areas that flooded the way that they did, it's important to understand the historical geomorphology of the area. And what you can see is that a significant amount of the waterfront property here is built on landfill that was built at very low elevations. And also there were a significant number of marshes that were filled in over time, again, lying at very low elevations. As a result of this, here along the waterfront in Brooklyn, what you saw was less of the structural damage that you saw in other parts of the city and much more of the destruction with respect to building systems that, especially in high-rise buildings, caused people to lose the ability to use the elevator or have water pumped to their apartments, but didn't necessarily destroy the building itself. And similarly, along the waterfront, you also had substantial impact on our infrastructure, whether it's wastewater treatment plants or MTA facilities like the subway and the Queens Midtown Tunnel. Now, the story in the south of Brooklyn was a slightly different story. Here, along the ocean-facing coast, there was actually a substantial amount of wave action that came directly ashore, and that caused a significant amount of damage. But in addition to that, you also had what we call backdoor flooding coming in from inlets and creeks that drove that inundation without the wave action deeper into the borough. Again here, if you understand the history of the area, you can understand a lot about why the areas that flooded. It's not just a question like on the waterfront of landfill and filled in marshes, but here also there were barrier islands in the past that have disappeared from the map over time and therefore didn't offer the protection to Coney Island, Sheepshead Bay that might have been afforded in the past. As a result of that, in this neighborhood, unlike along the waterfront, you didn't just see destruction with respect to building systems. You also saw actual destruction and significant damage to buildings, although less than you saw in some of the other neighborhoods in areas like Staten Island and the Rockaways. And again, infrastructure was significantly disrupted here in South Brooklyn. So that gives you a little bit of a taste of what happened during Sandy. But as I said, Sandy was a highly idiosyncratic event. And if the lesson that we learned from Hurricane Sandy was we have to prepare ourselves for the next Hurricane Sandy, then in fact, we'd be learning the wrong lesson. Because the chances of all of these circumstances coming together in exactly the same way and another storm affecting the city in exactly the same way as Sandy are slim to none. But that doesn't mean that we're vulnerable. And in fact, the city's vulnerability has been something that we've known for many, many years. In 1983, FEMA released its flood map that shows the 100-year floodplain and the 500-year floodplain. What you see on here in the light color is the 100-year floodplain, and the dark color is the 500-year floodplain. Just so you understand, what the 100-year floodplain means is that if you live in the 100-year floodplain, in any given year there's a 1% chance that your home will experience flooding. Whereas if you live in the 500-year floodplain, that means that in any given year there's a 0.2% chance that your home will experience flooding. And as you can see, even based on the maps from 1983, if you look today at the number of residents, the number of jobs, buildings, built area that is covered by these flood zones, it's significant. Hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of jobs, hundreds of millions of square feet of floor area. But as Hurricane Sandy showed us, in fact, the city is more vulnerable than the FEMA maps led us to believe. And what you see up here in the blue color is the extent of the 100-year floodplain, and in the red color what you see is the actual flooding outside of the 100-year floodplain. And as you can see from the statistics on the screen, almost a third of all red and yellow tag buildings were outside of the 100-year floodplain. Half of all impacted residential units were outside of the 100-year floodplain, and over half of all impacted buildings were outside of the 100-year floodplain. The good news is that FEMA knew that the vulnerability was more extensive and knew that these maps had to be updated, and in fact had started to update them even before Hurricane Sandy came. But it wasn't scheduled to complete those maps for another several months. However, because of the destruction of Hurricane Sandy and the need to give guidance to people as they rebuilt, FEMA made the unprecedented decision to release interim flood maps that give an indication of where these final flood maps are going to end up. And what you can see here is that those flood maps are much more extensive than the 1983 maps were. And as you can see in the area on the chart that's circled, the parts of the city that are covered now encompass nearly twice as many people, nearly twice as many jobs, nearly twice as many buildings as the 1983 flood zones. As depressing as all that may be, the fact is that actually these flood maps again understate our vulnerability. And that's because these flood maps are based on an historic set of data. They do not look forward, and they do not take into account things like sea level rise. They also don't take into account other climate change related risks, things like frequent downpours, which have effects on our water supply, and even just a rainstorm a few years ago shut down our subway system. They don't take into account things like heat waves, and actually this was very interesting to me. On average, heat kills more people every year in the United States than any other natural phenomenon. And they don't take into account things like drought, the effects of which I think are obvious, or sea level rise in and of itself. So there's obviously more work that we need to do to prepare ourselves for the future. And given those challenges, the Bloomberg administration has been focused on the causes and impacts of climate change for many years. In fact, in 2007, the administration released the groundbreaking Plan YC, which was a 30-year sustainability plan for the city. As part of that, we've been working with a group of climate change experts known as the New York City Panel on Climate Change, who has been helping us to predict what the future might look like given climate change. And the members of the Panel on Climate Change include academics from the institutions that you see on here and are among the leaders in the field of climate change. What they provided us in 2009 was a chart that looks to the future and says, what do we think New York is going to look like across a number of different areas given where we think climate change is heading. And this is a detailed map, and I will tell you that it's in the process of being updated because there's actually better science available. But what you can see here is that they actually created two different cases, looking at the medium term, which we're defining as the 2020s, and the long term, which we're defining as the 2050s. The base case, what they call their regular case, which assumes, based on 2009 information, the then best information about sea level rises. And then what they call their rapid ice melt case, which, depending on how you look at it, is either the upside or the downside case. But that is assuming that the ice shelf in Greenland and the western part of Antarctica melts much more rapidly than is currently anticipated. And what you can see from that is that there the impacts are much more significant. We are waiting to hear back from the panel to find out whether they think that the base case is more accurate or the rapid ice melt case is more accurate, and if there are other changes that need to be made to our projections. The other thing that we're doing is we're working with McKinsey and Swiss Re to develop a series of projections about what the costs of climate change, absent any intervention by the city and government, might be. And these lines are just illustrative and aren't necessarily indicative of where we're going to come out. But what we're trying to do is look at what kind of economic impact different types of storms might have on the city as sea levels rise, and therefore the base becomes more significant. And what all of this tells us is that, again, though Hurricane Sandy itself is unlikely to be repeated, the fact is that we have always been a vulnerable city, that the vulnerability, in fact, is greater than had previously been understood, that vulnerability is likely to grow as climate change and its effects begin to be felt in the city, and that there is a real cost of inaction. And that means that we have to start taking steps immediately to protect our city over the long term. And so that brings us to the special initiative and the question of what we should do. And we, as the special initiative, are focused on answering this question of what we should do on two different levels. First of all, on a macro level, what do we do citywide with respect to our critical systems and infrastructure, areas like coastal defenses, the built environment, energy, hospitals, et cetera. And then also on the micro level, looking in particular at the neighborhoods that were most significantly impacted by Sandy and asking how we rebuild them in a way that's better and smarter and safer than those neighborhoods were before. And our plans with respect to each of these areas are going to include very specific policy, regulatory, investment recommendations, as well as, we hope, sources and uses attached to each. The plans are still under development, and we're not likely to have those ready for discussion until the report comes out in May. But I can tell you that there are a few principles that we're looking to adhere to. First of all, we are not going to try to climate change-proof New York. That is impossible. It's impossible for New York. It's impossible for any city. But what we are trying to do is use a multi-layered approach that will reduce the impacts wherever possible of climate change while allowing the city to recover from those impacts faster than it has in the past. And we're thinking about these layers in several different ways. There's a layer of coastal defenses where we're going to try to ensure that there's less flooding, and where flooding occurs, that the impacts are less significant. We're thinking about the built environment and how we ensure that buildings sustain less serious damage, and again, where they're damaged, that they're rehabilitated faster. And of course, the third layer being the layer of infrastructure and critical systems. How do we make sure that our electrical grid doesn't go down, and if it does go down, that it comes back faster? In addition to that, we're also looking to address specific needs of the neighborhoods that were most devastated by Sandy. And the reason for that, of course, is a moral obligation that we have to our fellow citizens who were most impacted by the storm, but also because these neighborhoods provide us with a laboratory in which to experiment with different approaches and to ensure that we are putting forward the most resilient efforts across the entire city. Now, any plan like this is going to be extraordinarily expensive. So federal funding is going to be a very important part of what we do. And the good news is that the Congress passed and the President signed in February a $50 billion supplemental appropriation that brings Sandy-related aid to the New York region, the greater New York region. Now, one thing I will say about this $50 billion amount, this is subject to the sequester, so we actually think that it's now $47 billion. Our hope is that that will get solved at some point, but there's still a substantial amount of federal money. And as you can see, the money comes in multiple pots, but the one that is probably most important because it is most flexible is the pot that's labeled CDBG, which is Community Development Block Grant money, and that's administered by HUD. Of that money, 35%, or $5.4 billion, has been allocated by the HUD secretary. And as you can see, it was roughly split a third, a third, a third between among three jurisdictions, New York State, New Jersey, and the city of New York, which received a little over $1.7 billion. Of that $1.77 billion, the mayor has now announced $1 billion in programs, and we're in the process of developing programs for the other $700 million. But they include about $700 million for housing-related programs, $185 million for business recovery programs, primarily directed at small businesses, as well as other neighborhood recovery and resiliency efforts across the city in the amount of $140 million. So the bottom line is that, like many coastal cities, New York is going to be tested by changes in the environment. There is no question about that. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that there is no reason to believe that if we are smart about it, we can't address these challenges. And the reason for this is that if you look back just over the last 10 years, we have faced major challenges, and in each case have surpassed expectations. Whether it's September 11th and the amazing recovery of Lower Manhattan, whether it's the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the way that our economy has roared back, even if there's still work to do. The same will be true with climate change. We have to, though, make sure that as we address the impacts of climate change, we're not just rebuilding what was lost, but we're also making what is today vulnerable less vulnerable, and that we're making New York a model for resiliency, not just for American cities, but for cities worldwide. And I look forward to reporting back to you in May, hopefully with a comprehensive plan that addresses each of those points. So thank you very much.
we're just going to start moving to the next panel. We have the panel starting in about a minute. And thanks to President Pinsky and thanks to our panelists.
And it's quite the unwieldy topic, and we only have a little bit of time. But we have the good fortune, or maybe the misfortune, of taking a lot of things as given. It's kind of shocking. I was in college in the 90s, and I remember when we were introduced to climate change as a potential problem and debated it vigorously. And now there's a lot of things that we can just move out of the way and get to solving problems. One question that we don't have to spend any time on is, well, to what extent was Hurricane Sandy caused by climate change? That's the wrong kind of question to ask. Every single weather event is affected by the amount of heat and moisture and warmth that we have introduced into the atmosphere. And we've introduced quite a bit of it over the years. The evocative example that we often hear is that we essentially introduced the energy equivalent of 500 million Hiroshima bombs into the atmosphere every year. And much of that gets absorbed by the seas. And so climate change is underway, sea level rise is underway. It, at the moment, is more of an invisible tsunami because we measure it by millimeters, but very shortly we'll be measuring it in feet. And by the end of the century, we'll be up to anywhere between 2 to 6 feet of additional sea level rise. And the context in which future storms will take place will be fundamentally altered from what we experience today. Just go back a few years to Hurricane Katrina, and you look at some of the parishes in New Orleans. Well, today, Orleans Parish, for example, is about half below sea level, and by the end of the century, almost all of it will be below sea level. And the inland seas that serve as a protective barrier in terms of barrier islands and marshes, much of that will have been done away with, and so the open seas will be left, and they will facilitate surges of storms in the future. And there's not a lot that we can say about, well, are we going to reverse these temperature increases, or are we going to reverse in the aggregate the vulnerability of populations, because already more than half of our country is within an hour's drive of a coastline, and 1 out of every 100 Americans lives within 1 meter of high tide. And so that is going to be a reality going forward, and those numbers are increasing. And some of the idiosyncratic elements of Hurricane Sandy that we heard about in Seth's remarks are going to become less so. You think about the 100-year high tide, the 1% chance of that level occurring in a year. By mid-century, that will occur every year. And as Seth said, these types of hurricanes that we're talking about today are not going to be the principal disasters that we contend with. We're going to contend with greater numbers of extreme precipitation and flooding, as well as the types of heat-related events that we saw in Europe. It's pretty shocking to think about how quickly we forget that in 2003, tens of thousands of people succumbed to 100-plus degree temperature over many days in that part of the world. And sadly, there's no comprehensive approach at the national level to encouraging resiliency, and so we're stuck with efforts at the state and local level. Now, the good news is many of the tools that we need to encourage resiliency, state and local governments already have, and they've used them in other contexts to battle flooding and sprawl development and the like, everything from the top to the bottom, from changing comprehensive plans to beginning a conversation about the areas of vulnerability, to encouraging development further upland, to thinking more creatively in the 100 and 500-year flood ranges that you heard about in terms of what kinds of building codes to introduce. And so many of these tools are at our disposal, but we have to think less reactively about it. We have to not be silly about it. We can't pass any more legislation like states like North Carolina did immediately before Sandy, not allowing state agencies to share data about sea level rise. And we have to be more comprehensive and remember that sea level rise is taking place within an ecosystem of other forces, including ongoing coastal development, and some of the efforts to rebuild in the wake of a storm are going to get in the way of some of the efforts to increase our resiliency. But we have many of the tools already at our disposal. The trick is to just think about how to think about them more proactively, comprehensively, and to think about how we can facilitate not just resilience, but also limiting the potential for loss by recognizing that there are areas from which we must retreat and move further upland because we are in a new era. We're in an era of the billion-dollar loss event, and we only had 14 of them in 2011. So the problems are vast, but we've got a stellar panel to talk about them today. As you noted, as was noted earlier, the bios are in your materials. But we'll begin with Howard Slatkin, who is the Director of Sustainability for the New York City Department of City Planning, and I believe Howard has a slideshow to talk about some of these tools that are available.
Thank you, Greg. If you can hear me. You will, I apologize in advance that you will see a couple of facts and figures that are repetitive with what Seth Pinsky showed you a few moments ago. I'll offer that as testament to the high levels of coordination within city government that we are using the same information. But in all seriousness, you know, we have been working, the agencies are working closely together on a variety of levels in the response to Hurricane Sandy and the planning thereafter. Today I'm going to talk about one, I think, narrow slice of that response, and it's really how the city has acted quickly to use building codes and zoning to help promote more resilient rebuilding in the wake of the storm. First, as Seth mentioned, the types of effects that Hurricane Sandy had on New York City's coastline varied. You had, on the Atlantic-facing coastlines, you had heavy wave action and high storm surge, as well as still water flooding in the Upper Harbor and further north. These types of influences led to different levels of damage and different types of damage. I'm going to skip ahead just a second, reorder my slides here. There are different types of flood zones that are designated by FEMA within coastal flood hazard areas. And basically they differentiate between areas that are subject to wave action hazards and areas that are subject primarily to still water flooding. But key things here are that they distinguish between what are called V zones, which are for velocity and wave action, and A zones, which are primarily still water flooding. And for each of these areas, a base flood elevation is designated on the FEMA maps for the 1% annual chance storm, the 1 in 100-year storm, which is a benchmark for many purposes. In each of these areas, there are flood regulations that are required by FEMA to be upheld by the municipalities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. New York City has those in its building code, has had them there since 1983. And they speak differently to the different hazards in A zones and V zones. Here, I sometimes say, this is the good news. This is a problem that has been solved, or we know how to solve. How do you design a building to address a known flood risk? You have, in A zones, in the upper diagram, you essentially, in most buildings, in residential buildings, in most buildings, you elevate the lowest floor above the expected flood elevation. And then anything below that floor is not used as occupied floor area. There are flood vents and openings to let water in and out of the building in a flood event, which is important to equalize the pressure on both sides of the wall and preserve the structural stability of the building. But essentially the space above that remains dry during the flood event. On the lower diagram, you see the somewhat more drastic solution that's required in V-zones, in velocity zones, which is what you see when you go to beach communities in many locations around the United States and around the world. Buildings on stilts, essentially. What you have is pile-supported foundations so that when the waves are passing beneath the building, the force is not transmitted to the structure of the building, but essentially the wave is allowed to break beneath the building and without adversely affecting, again, the structure of the building. Immediately, well, actually, let me jump back for 1 second and talk a little bit about the stock of buildings that New York City has, what makes us different from some other places, and I think some things that not everyone is immediately aware of when thinking about flood risks in New York City. In many places, coastal development is a relatively new phenomenon. Buildings are relatively young, and people often think of the waterfront as an area where we have recently developed and created this risk exposure, but actually 84% of the buildings in the area that was inundated by Hurricane Sandy were built before 1983, and that's before the first FEMA flood maps were available for New York City. So these buildings, by and large, include no flood protection measures. Buildings that were built after 1983 would have adhered to building code, which incorporated these types of standards that I just outlined. For that reason, among others, you saw that the heaviest damage during Hurricane Sandy occurred in those buildings that were built before 1983. So 84% of the buildings in the area were pre-1983, but 98% of the buildings destroyed and 94% of the buildings that were structurally compromised by the storm were built prior to 1983. One of the lessons here is that building codes matter. Building codes make a difference. There's another lesson, though, that I'll come up with in just a moment. On January 31st, there were two actions that were taken by the mayor and by the buildings commissioner in order to enhance flood resilience. One of them I'll touch on first is what is called informally a freeboard rule, but is a rulemaking that updated the building code to incorporate what's known as freeboard into the flood regulations, which means, very simply, if the base flood elevation for your property on the FEMA flood insurance map is X, then you must elevate to X plus 1 or X plus 2. This is a margin of error that's built into the codes for an additional level of safety. It provides some protection against more severe storms. It provides some degree of protection against future sea level rise, and is becoming widely accepted as best practice in building codes around the country. What you can see here is that you take a building that was built before 1983, may have been built more or less at grade. It has a base flood elevation that's at 4 feet above grade. The previous building code requirements would have required you to elevate the lowest floor to that level. With the freeboard rule for 1 and 2 family homes, an additional 2 feet of elevation is required. So as of, again, this January, this adds an additional level to the minimum requirements under building code to make newer buildings more flood resilient. Now, I said there were two lessons. One is that codes matter. The other one is that proper flood risk information also matters. And as Seth Pinsky alluded to earlier, the base flood elevations on the maps for New York City currently still date back to 1983. The inundation area from Hurricane Sandy was much larger than that, included twice as many buildings as were in the current flood insurance rate map 1% chance storm zone. And the size of this area is really, I think, important to understand too. The area that was affected by the hurricane included roughly 800,000 residents, about 10% of the city's population. This was a very large storm, and it affected a very large area. The question, I don't think, is whether people should be living there. The fact is that people are. They have been for quite some time. and how can we make it safer and more resilient for people to live in these communities. FEMA took a big step forward, as Seth mentioned, by releasing these advisory-based flood elevation maps. These are the first, the best available information that currently exists. They turn these around very quickly after the storm event. They are available to people who are trying to make decisions about what can they do with their damaged or destroyed homes, what should they do on a piece of property they're considering building on. They're not regulatory maps. FEMA does not require, they're not tied directly to the National Flood Insurance Program. That will happen with new flood insurance rate maps that will be issued in their draft form for public comment first later this year. But on January 28th, FEMA began to release these advisory-based flood elevation maps for New York City. And actually, this is an old slide. By the end of February, they did release the maps for all of New York City. And this information is all available, and there's actually a really great engine that FEMA has online where you can punch in an address. It will tell you your current base flood elevation, your advisory-based flood elevation, and actually now, with the data that New York City has provided on elevation, it'll give you an approximate sense of the level of the land in that area. So property owners can begin to understand what the implications of these flood elevations are. But codes I mentioned, there's zoning is another regulation that the city has that can help address some of these issues. Now, one of the things that happened immediately after the release of this information is people, of course, want to be able to make the proper adjustments to their homes, to build or retrofit to these new standards. But we found that there are certain conflicts that would arise in zoning if you tried to build to those standards. Essentially, if you adhered to the best practices that FEMA is suggesting, you would run into, I think, two main problems. One is the way that the height limits are measured in zoning, and the other is how it treats the reconstruction of damaged and destroyed buildings. And I'll touch on both of those in just a minute. These were the subject of an executive order issued by the mayor on January 31st, just days after the advisory flood elevations were issued. The purpose of this was to enable people, enable building owners, property owners, to reduce the vulnerability to future flooding, to protect themselves against future increases in flood insurance premiums, which are going to increase as a result of action that Congress took last July with the Bigger Waters bill that reauthorized the National Flood Insurance Program, which brings what were previously subsidized rates for existing homes and existing buildings up rather quickly to market rate, meaning that if you are not built to the new flood insurance, the new flood elevation for your area, the cost of insuring your home is going to increase substantially. So understanding this information is going to be very important to homeowners. And finally, there are certain funding sources that, such as some of the federal dollars that are about to flow right now, that may require use of the adhering to the advisory-based flood elevation. So for all these reasons, we want to enable people to adapt. The executive order contained a number of different provisions. I'll summarize the two key aspects of it rather quickly. One is zoning typically measures the height of a building from either grade or the base flood elevation as shown on the current flood insurance rate maps. There are some areas where you might not have had a base flood elevation. You could have had a house like this where the grade was 6 feet above the standard datum that the flood insurance maps are measured from. The lowest floor of the building was 9 feet above, but all of a sudden now you have an advisory-based flood elevation that's 12 feet above. Say this building was damaged or destroyed, or just that the owner wants to, at some point, elevate the building in order to protect it against future floods. The zoning as drawn today would not necessarily allow that. So what the executive order allows is it allows for this building to be raised up, for that lowest floor to be above the advisory base flood elevation, as shown. I'm going to lean over my other shoulder. As shown here. So if this building was damaged and reconstructed, you could elevate it. If the building is being retrofitted, you can also elevate it. Another key provision is the second set of bullets here. Zoning generally restricts the reconstruction of buildings that don't comply with zoning. You have a lot of existing, what are called non-conforming uses, uses that don't comply with the current use regulations, or non-complying buildings that have either smaller yards than are allowed or are taller than current height limits allow. Because most of the buildings in New York City were built before the current zoning designations were applied, there are many buildings that fit that description, and many of the damaged or destroyed buildings also fit that description. Zoning generally restricts these because the idea is that over time these buildings will phase out and be replaced by complying buildings. But there's nothing gradual about the damage that occurred during the storm. So the idea of the executive order was for buildings that were damaged or destroyed during this event, they could be rebuilt with their previous non-compliances or non-conformances. Certain types of buildings could be rebuilt, provided that those buildings were elevated or flood-proofed to the new advisory-based flood elevations. So the idea is that making it easier for people to replace what they had, but looking forward at making the building more resilient. There's a lot of details to this. I'll refer people to our website for the nitty-gritty details on City Planning's website and also on the Department of Buildings website, where there's a guide to flood zone construction that includes a lot of this information. But that's just a window into some of the key actions that have been taken in the early days following the hurricane. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. And now, given a little preview of some of the tools that we do have at our disposal, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Chris Serkin, who's going to talk about the affirmative obligations of governments to respond to sea level rise. Chris?
So it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Sparrow folks, especially Lee, for having me here, because it's not every day that sort of an esoteric property theorist has the opportunity to sit down and talk to people who are engaged in these issues on the ground. As it turns out, I think the very esoteric, very theoretical project that I'm working on right now actually has something to tell us about what our government responses may be and what they in fact may have to be if I'm right about what the Constitution compels. So this talk is shifting gears quite a bit from what we have heard. This is not nitty-gritty details on the ground. This is a general conceptual argument that I'm going to sketch that I hope that some of you may be able to take out into the field and actually deploy if I'm right. I will say, though, that these thoughts are still quite tentative, and if you push me too hard, I'm unlikely to know the answer. But for what it's worth, I also want to say that I think my argument is not particularly directed to New York City, especially for reasons that will become clear, because I think New York City is actually doing quite an extraordinary job responding to sea level rise, and is in many ways on the leading edge of responses. So what we've seen today is that there are a range of regulatory policy solutions that governments can adopt to deal with the growing threat of sea level rise. Those include things like increasing setbacks from the ocean so that people have to build farther away, right? New building design regulations, so people have to build higher. Various forms of soft armoring, that is, beach reclamation, regrowing wetlands, things like that. Right? The problem with some of these, from the perspective of governments, not New York City so much, but from the perspective of some governments, some state governments, some local governments, is that there's a real risk that some of these regulatory responses may actually generate takings claims. That is to say, they are regulations that may reduce the value of beachfront owners' property to an extent that they are unconstitutional takings of property that will create liability, financial liability for the government. Now, there is a lot of thinking going on right now about whether these claims are viable or plausible. There are a lot of reasons to think that they are not or should not be. But the reality on the ground is that there are a number of governmental actors who are at least worried enough about this threat of financial liability that they think the safer course of action is not to act. And I've heard this from some attorneys who represent some governments who say, look, the people we're talking to, they don't want to implement some of these policies because they're worried about the financial liability of regulatory takings claims. So what I want to argue today is that, in fact, the takings clause may compel governments to act. That, in fact, the failure to act can also violate the takings clause and can be unconstitutional. I'm calling these kinds of takings claims passive takings claims, takings as a result of government inaction. And I want to be clear how wildly unorthodox this is, right? I mean, don't run into court and argue this without acknowledging how unusual this claim is, right? Because it's very clear that most people conceive of the Constitution as creating negative rights against the government. That is, rights to be free from certain kinds of government action. The Constitution does not, by and large, compel the government to act. In fact, there have been efforts in this regard. Going back to the 60s, there were efforts to call welfare and other kinds of welfare services affirmative obligations the government had to provide, and uniformly, the United States Supreme Court has rejected those arguments and has always characterized the Constitution as a constitution of negative rights or negative liberties. I want to suggest, though, that there is something different about the Takings Clause, and there's something different about the nature of property that make these kinds of claims particularly appealing in ways that they haven't been before. But let me acknowledge here the problem is one of line drawing. I want to be clear that I am not suggesting that every time someone's property is damaged, the government is liable, right? It's not like if your house burns down, you can say the government has somehow taken your property for failing to protect it. That is absolutely not my claim. But I do have an overarching intuition here, which is that in some contexts, and sea level rise is one of them, either action or inaction amounts to an allocation of loss. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, and I think in many people's minds, right, that that government action in this regard is going to cost some people money, right, and save other people money. But so will government inaction, right? Government inaction is just as predictably going to lead to foreseeable harms and damages to people and save others. I want to suggest, right, that the government shouldn't be able to escape financial liability by relying on this distinction between action and omission. And in fact, if that distinction is in place, the governments may have perverse incentives not to act in places and in times when we think they should. And this is one of them. Okay? So it seems to me, right, the challenge for me conceptually is to come up with a justification for when these passive takings claims are appealing and plausible and why they are here. Let me sketch out 3 underlying justifications that I think come together in the context of sea level rise. This is still fairly tentative. But if there's one place where governments have incurred affirmative constitutional obligations to act, it's when the government has disabled self-help. So this arises in the context of prisoners. Often, if people are in government custody, the government has affirmative obligations to defend those people, to provide them with health care, to provide them with food. This is often a matter of 8th Amendment rights or substantive due process, but at least this is a place where the government incurs some affirmative obligations to act. Likewise, I think where the government has defined the content, the substantive content of people's property rights in a very, very narrow way, or at least in a highly restrictive way, the government cannot then throw up its hands if 20, 30, 40 years from now, or 20, 30, 40 years later, some ecological change threatens the content of property rights. The government can't say, hey, we didn't do anything. Well, in fact, in these contexts, the government is so entangled in the substantive content of people's rights that the government should not be able to say, we didn't act because we didn't adopt an affirmative regulation. And finally, there are contexts in which government has made substantial demands of people in the past with the implicit promise of long-term reciprocal benefits. We are going to burden you now, but don't worry, you are going to come out ahead in the long run over the long term. Okay? My suggestion is where some ecological change, like sea level rise, interferes with those promised benefits, again, the government may have an obligation to act. And I think all of these come together in the context of sea level rise. There are situations, not New York so much, but there are situations in which governments have disabled self-help. That is, they have height limits, building height limits, that are not keyed to floodplains, right? Or so that people cannot put their houses on stilts, right? Because they interact with the height limits. There are other places, right, where property owners are not allowed to engage in certain kinds of armoring, either hard or soft, because of rights of the public to access the beach, for example, or other kinds of restrictions. The government also has clearly regulated beachfront property highly restrictively. In fact, most beachfront property owners are subject to overlapping webs of regulation from federal, state, and local governments, all of which mean that what people are allowed to do and what they're limited in doing is highly constrained by the government, so that the government cannot then say, hey, we didn't do anything here. Right? And I think government has made demands with the promise of long-term benefits of beachfront ownership. So I want to suggest then that property owners may have a plausible constitutional claim against the government for failing to protect them, or at least take actions that will sensibly allocate the risks and minimize the long-term risks of sea level rise. This is not to say that people have an individual right to actually win. That is, these are not per se takings claims, right? I'm simply saying that the traditional takings apparatus should apply to government inaction in this context as well as government action. And the last thing I want to speculate is about why this might actually be doctrinally plausible in this context, unlike in other contexts. And I think one of the reasons, and there are a few here, but I'll leave it at one in the interest of time, is that this argument really messes up political priors. Because I am arguing for quite a radical expansion of private property protection, right? That is traditionally a very conservative view. I'm arguing for an expansion of the takings clause in this dramatic way that includes government action. But what I'm saying is I love private property so much that I want to demand that the government come in and protect it. And I think that this is confusing enough to traditional political valences that it is actually plausible. Either, right, everyone is going to love this or everyone is going to hate it. We'll find out which. But those are my thoughts, and it's a real pleasure to have a chance to share them with you.
Thank you very much. And speaking of the web of regulations, we've heard a little bit today about green design and efforts to lend resilience to cities by doing things such as adding porous surfaces and street trees and the like. And our last speaker on the panel this afternoon, Terry Matthews, who's the senior policy advisor for the New York City Department of Design and Construction. She's going to talk about one precise area of development where, just as Chris mentioned, there are these webs of regulation that might get in the way of more sustainable development. Terry?
Excuse me, I'm really glad I spoke to you yesterday, and I came after you, because, is this working? Can you hear me?
Lenient.
Oh, okay. So, I run a program called Town and Gown. It's a systemic action research program in the built environment. It focuses on the built environment. If you can touch it, we can research it. And Brooklyn Law School has been a very early and ardent supporter of Town and Gown, Deborah Frischtel. We've been doing a number of projects with her clinical students on a number of built environment issues. So I didn't know how to prepare for this. I mean, I can talk about this project in my sleep, but coming in the context of this panel, I wasn't sure what I was going to say. But so let me put it in the context. You're talking about the tools of local government. That's implicated in here. You've been talking about, atmospheric conditions on the ground. We're talking about under the ground here, which makes things much more complicated. There was a list up here of, we were talking primarily about buildings. In the world of the built environment, there are the structures, and then there's the infrastructure. Structures are vertical, and infrastructure is horizontal. And there are differences. In one of the charts, and I think this was Seth Pinsky, they actually mentioned utilities. And that's what this project that I'm going to talk about involves. And it just touches on a lot of the stuff you were talking about. You talk about governmental inaction and the zoning and the building code. But the place that I'm going to discuss that we've been talking about, you talk about people being subject to overlapping levels of government and unable to act. And this project, that I hope I can get into some depth, or at least go further into it. If you look at New York City, and you look at the infrastructure that I'm about to talk about, it feels like we're enmeshed in, there's a technical term that I won't use, but I think it's a collective recursive action. You can see why we have the problem. And this problem that I'm about to talk about didn't come up as resiliency. It came up as just why do the streets, they don't work. You've seen them. There are potholes. You see the, cosmetic, it looks like Band-Aids. You lay a new street, and the next thing you know, they're torn up for the underground utilities. So we came at this through Town and Gown, which I'll try to do a quick job of explaining. What we found by trying to focus on life cycle costs, that's how we got into it. The more we kept digging, and what happens in systemic action research is you start with a question, and you answer part of the question. Systemic action research means you research for purposes of action. You're not just researching to research. So it's joining the practitioner and the academic in applied research. The whole point of this is to make things better. We're just not researching, although legal research is different. You just don't research to research. I'm a lawyer too. So in Town and Gown, we have lots of agencies putting in research questions. And at the beginning, I guess of the second term, somewhere in the middle of the second term, NYC just emerged. It galvanized everybody's attention and interest. And Department of Transportation wanted to increase sustainable roadway design and the use of sustainable materials. And this was a little bit before we started focusing on green infrastructure, but there's a connection because sustainable materials can actually help increase the absorption of the rainwater. But this really started out, we were talking about sustainable materials not adversely affecting the environment. So new roadway design, new materials, compared to the traditional stuff, is more expensive, at least initially. And the thinking is, well, if you do this other thing, it'll save you money over the long term. I'm over me. I only have a certain pot of money. An agency comes to me and says, we want to do something new, and yeah, it's going to cost a little bit of money, but we're really going to save money in the long term. And bear in mind, our long term is 5 years, so if you're talking about a way long term, you can't even capture it in our budget, which doesn't mean you can't focus on it, but some days just the next 5 years is looking pretty touchy. So under Town and Gown, they put in this question, how to do life cycle costing of roadways, sustainable roadway design and sustainable materials that take into account the long-term cost benefits. You know, this is the whole argument, the 3 E's, equity, economic, and equity, economic, and environment. Thank you. and when I also went to graduate school in public policy, and this was way before the 90s, actually. Well, this idea of cost benefits that you can't quite quantify. We learned about all these modeling techniques, cost benefit, and when I was going to school, forget about sustainability. It was just things that you really couldn't quantify. People said, well, you could do it, but nobody ever does it. And so you go into government, and nobody's talking about this. When the sustainability agenda hit, it was like it linked back to that old thinking, these old ideas of doing life cycle costing, of doing cost-benefit analysis that take into account things that aren't always quantifiable. And so, because I remember this from graduate school, I thought this would be a great project. So we had NYU Wagner. This was for Town and Gown. DOT was a client. My agency, DDC, we do the road work. When DEP projects and DOT projects come together, it's a total road reconstruction. We do that work. We coordinate it. So the Wagner School is public policy. It has a capstone. It's sort of like a clinical. It's a experiential learning program. They developed it's not that, you know, we're all taught this in graduate school, but they were doing it in the context of sustainability. So they did a life cycle cost model, and they brought in all of that, you know, good cost benefit, mostly the benefit, because we all know what the costs are, but we're trying to get at the benefit, the avoided cost, basically. And we got to this point, and they had a whole year. Their capstone lasted a whole year. We got to this point where we're trying to find the data. And we're having meetings, you know, my agency has data. And somehow in this, it's late, they come after work because everybody works. And so all of a sudden we're talking about the utilities. And the one thing you should know, because I experienced it before I worked for DDC, I worked for the mayor's office, and this was sort of my area, the construction area. Whenever you talk about roadways, no matter what the issue is, you just can't get away from utilities, and it just is this thing. And so when we were doing this, talking about data, where's the data, we're talking about the utilities again. And it was just a very kind of weird moment. You felt compelled to explain to the students this very complex thing that only people in government ever really know about, and utility companies. Because when you talk about cost, especially the long-term cost, the life cycle of the thing, well, the utilities are always in the street. They're always cutting into the street. Everything is underground. There might be some parts of Queens. I think Brooklyn is all underground. You've got the water, the sewer, electricity, telecommunications, which is now changing. You know, it used to be cable, and now it's, and you have telephone, and they have fiber optics. In Manhattan, you have the steam. Have I forgotten anything? Gas, natural gas. And that's all under the streets. And nobody knows, I mean, finding it, looking for it is an issue, so you're in there for that. roadway is a public asset. The law on the roadway is we hold it in trust with the public. We don't actually own it, but we have it in trust with the public. And the utilities underground have their ability to be there is through this franchise and or contract. So I'm not. Let me try to move ahead. So we ran into a data problem. Okay, there was no data, especially that long lifetime cycle thing. And the project ended. I'm not sure if the students felt that it was a rewarding project for them, but in town and gown, it doesn't matter. As long as you have something in paper, I can take it and follow it up in a successive year, because no work should be lost. You should always build upon it. That's the systemic action research model. Just keep going. So we do these symposium events every year. So you take the work, kind of like this, a little bit, but smaller groups, and you take the work and you have a conversation about it, because the students might not have been happy, but we're at a place where, okay, they couldn't find the data, we couldn't help them find the data, where's the data? So that was our first symposium event. Actually, it was the very first one we did last year. And it was like, where's the data? And it was a mix of people who came to it, city people, Department of Transportation, we had some folks from OMB. I think we had a lot of Fordham people that year, and people who didn't do, they were in different disciplines. It's kind of, these symposium events get different kinds of people. And they were talking about research techniques to identify the data. Your typical academic thing. We were having this academic talk about data and blah, blah, blah. And then next thing you know, we're talking about the utilities again. And it was just one of those moments where you thought, okay, maybe we should start talking about the utilities. And it was this conversation where one guy said, well, and it has to do with, okay, so now I'm talking about design of under the roadway. The stuff went in as it was invented. Literally, and you should go to Chambers Street, actually, where there are a lot of open pits, because we're reconstructing that whole street. And it looks like spaghetti. It looks like spaghetti when it went in 100 years ago, and it still looks like spaghetti. And part of the problem in parts of New York is the roadway is pretty, it's built in, it's a narrow place. You don't have, and some parts, if I'm going too late, let me know. But you've got the subways. It's just very congested. And is it too late?
You have another minute or two.
Okay. So at any rate, we did, where's the data? We started focusing on the utilities, because that seemed to be really important. And we thought it was an issue of regulated utilities, which, oh, by the way, is not regulated down here. It's regulated as a public, it's like a whole separate, it's not even the state. It's like a different animal. And these utilities, if you try, and so the idea was, and this was the project, we had 5 Brooklyn Law students working on this, trying to understand, okay, so if the problem is with the utilities and it's impacting, we're having a problem, a physical problem, what is it about their life, their world, that makes this so difficult? So we thought we would put ourselves in the shoes of the regulated utility. Like, what does that look like? So we did it for gas and electric, and well, you know what, we haven't, it just gets more and more complicated, and that's why I went after you. What happens when government is in that same place? As that poor private owner who is so entangled in a substantive context of regulation and rights. And so I have no answers, but I'm very excited to be able to talk about this. So thank you.
And thank you very much, Terry. And we have time for some questions. Of course, I want to give our panelists a chance to respond to Chris's idea, which he's introduced as an idea everyone will love or hate. And so we have representatives from city government here. And I'll start with Howard. Howard, have you had the opportunity to consider the takings implications? Many of the types of local land use tools that are available to combat sea level rise do present the possibility of restricting the value of property. Have you given thought to the takings issue? And what do you think of Chris's idea?
Well, this is a fun question. I think I'll start out by saying I'm a planner, not counsel to the planning department. So
you can be as wide-ranging
I will demur on
the.
But I actually think that listen. I think government action on all these issues is complex. Everything that we do at city planning goes through a very intense public review process involving review by 1 to 59 community boards, borough presidents, and the city planning commission, the city council, and a very robust democratic process. And we are very proud of all that we do accomplish through that process. I think the point that you made, Chris, about I think the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish, I think, is in many ways consistent with the ideas that you're laying out, in that we found that there was a conflict. I would call this good government in a certain ways, but a conflict between emerging building code standards and what zoning allowed. And as a matter of fact, a colleague, actually a professor at Columbia University who is very active on climate resilience issues, shared stories with us and actually with I think the New York Times about his inability to raise his own home above the floodplain. And this is a scientist, a geologist who's spent an extraordinary amount of time documenting climate hazards and risks, and there he is trying to get his kitchen above the flood elevation, and his local zoning board says, no, you're not allowed to do that. Our height limit is X number of feet. And it's a real issue, and it's an issue with very direct meaning to homeowners all over the place. And I think that what we've been trying to accomplish here is to say, if there are best practices that are out there, that are reasonable, that are based on the best available information that we have from FEMA, let's enable people to adhere to them. And let's reconcile our building code and our zoning with each other. The broader issues of sort of regulation of property rights, I think there's fascinating material of which I will not comment on further. But there are, I think, restrictive approaches and there are permissive approaches, and I think they raise different sets of issues.
Great. Terry, did you want to respond to the basic idea? And as is true with a lot of panels, by the end of the panel, we've almost finished framing the problem. And so, you know, it's fascinating how the federal landscape for responding to some of these types of disasters like flooding has remained relatively stable in recent years in terms of what FEMA's obligations are with flood insurance and responding to disasters and what the Army Corps does. And yet when you burrow down into state and local responses and you try to marry a couple of those responses, you begin to see how they can be at cross purposes, and it becomes an issue of agreeing that climate change has locked in these effects over the next 40 years, agreeing to what some of those effects are. That's the simple part. And trying to marry some of these regulatory responses is the hard work. We have time for a couple questions in the audience. Yes, ma'am.
So I'd like to see if I can...
There's a microphone for you.
I'd like to see if we can wed the two panels. Because what I heard in the first panel was a lot of stories about individual citizens and how they're harmed. And what I hear in the second panel sounds like it's imposing a lot of obligations and requirements on those very people. So if we're going to think about sustainability and the cost of sustainability on those individuals, if you can't get flood insurance because you're now in a zone that's increased and now is the flood zone, and you can't raise your brick building up several feet, and now your property is worth zero. So what happens